Rabbi, Rosensweig. Welcome to everyone. Welcome to a distinguished panelist, Rabbi Penner as well. And welcome to all of you. We're waiting for Rabbi Taragin, who is on the way over. He'll be here shortly, so he'll catch us in midstream, I believe. And just by way of introduction, titled this panel is "The World Too Much With Us, the DEVAR HASHEM in the Digital Age." And I want to focus a little bit this afternoon on some of the challenges and the opportunities the digital age presents to us as Jews committed to a life of Torah and mitzvahs. The title, for those who are more literarily inclined, with a nod to Morenu v'Rabbeinu of Aaron Lichtenstein's Evitzad Kaddish Livracha, a paraphrase of a poem, a sonnet by Wordsworth, that he wrote at the turn of the 19th century, entitled "The World Is Too Much With Us." In that poem, which was about the Industrial Revolution, expressed his lament that the Industrial Revolution itself had distanced people from nature and from each other and from themselves. We're now well into the digital information revolution, whatever the name of it might be. It's still up for grabs, but the question in our context, of course, is not about nature per se, but about what could be broadly referred to as the Olam HaTorah, the conveyance of the DEVAR HASHEM, and the impact of this on our world as Jews who are questing for a relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam. So Yonatan Shai Friedman was helping coordinate today. He gave me express reshus to mention a story that he relayed on the Etzion listserv, which is how, of course, many of us who are Bogrim of the Yeshiva continue to communicate and to stay in touch about common issues of concern. That story was a story that he himself heard from Rav Yair Khan from around 2002. And the story was that Rav Yair Khan paid a Shiva call at the home of Meir Schlesinger, the Rosh Yeshiva Shalavim. Rav Schlesinger told him at the Shiva that Machon Somet was working on a Shabbos telephone, and that some Rabbanim had heard about this telephone, and their immediate reaction was, it's usser, it's a slippery slope, it'll be the end of Shabbos, that such a phone could exist. Rav Schlesinger said that he recounted that when Rav Lichtenstein was consulted about the same issue, his initial reaction was, you mean I could speak to the Rav on Shabbos and share Divrei Torah with him? So Rav Schlesinger was lamenting the obvious distinction between the two approaches, positive or negative as polarities. He said it can be true of any technology. It can be used properly to help the world, to spread Torah, etc., to be Margaret's Torah, or, God forbid, for cross purposes, working at cross purposes with that. So just in terms of framing some of the discussion. We're honored today to have among our panelists people with differing perspectives, differing levels of experience, and living through, such as we all are, this period of time. And with certain extremely radical changes on one level, another level, continuity with everything that came before, just new vessels, new modalities of communication, and possibly, potentially, our butts of Torah. So let me open just by once again welcoming the panelists. My lengthy introduction notwithstanding, Taragin is still on the way over, so we'll start with our panelists who are here. And just to pose the question, I mean, what are some of the advantages, obvious advantages aside, but beyond the technical advantages, are there other advantages to these new technologies in terms of Talmud Torah that you've seen in your teaching, in your interaction with Talmidim over this period of time, over the last decade? Do you see any shift?
Firstly, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Rabbi Engel for coordinating, certainly my part.
Use the microphone.
What's that? We'll get a little louder. The question of, obviously, the integrating new technology into the ancient and, the raison d'etre of our lives, which is Limud Torah, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, is obviously a question that doesn't have a simple answer, like most questions do not. The truth is that new technologies have always been a part of the landscape of any ancient discipline, and that's true for Talmud Torah as well. Obviously, going way back, the ideal of Dvarim shebasav yat Torah shel omer in Baal Peh, Dvarim shebal Peh yat Torah shel omer b'ksav. The idea that Torah shebasav and Torah shebal Peh constitute, distinct disciplines that are intended to accomplish different but interlocking goals is something which, at a point in our history, was, because of Eis Lasos Hashem Be'Feir Torasecha, was deemed to be counterproductive, and that, created a revolution in its own right. The idea of writing of Torah Shebal Peh, steps at that time needed to be taken in order to ensure that that this change, let's say, in policy, that adopting new techniques in Limud Torah, adapting in some respects an old principle, would be constructive and would not undermine the original intent behind that division. And again, the laws of Dvarim shebal Peh yat Torah shel omer b'ksav and its corollary Chazal found different ways to continue to express and to ensure that Torah shebal would accomplish its particular goal, its distinctive goal, and Torah shebal Peh would accomplish its. And again, I'm not going to survey the whole history, although it would be helpful if we had more time. But obviously, when manuscripts and especially when printing came about, that constituted a major revolution. And even substantive halachic questions like Talmud al Yorah, Bifnei Rabo, things of that sort. The idea of the dependence of students, of disciples from their mentors. The idea that there could be written Rabbeim, and that somehow you could cross through history. It could be a Talmud of Rav Ashi and Ravina, and of the Ramban and the Rambam. That had its impact as well, as I say, even on those particular questions. And once again, we find that the same kind of care, the same kind of dialectic resulted. In other words, that on the one hand, the benefits of that revolution of printing, which was really a revolution, access to books, access to things that had not been accessible for many generations, which obviously generated a level of independence, that would be constructive, that the benefits of that would be gleaned. And at the same time, there was still a recognition that the old and classical methods, the concept of Masorah, that Ish Mipi Ish, Moshe Rabbeinu, the idea of cultivating a Rebbe, and everything that goes along with that is a sine qua non for success in Talmud Torah, that needed to continue as well. And if we analyze again how these changes were integrated into the halachic system and to Limud Torah, I said it's very instructive. The balance that emerges is something that is very impressive. So certainly in the time of new technologies, originally radio and then television and then obviously the internet and the expansion of the internet, I guess what we're calling the digital age, is not really different in that respect. It too provides benefits in terms of access to knowledge. Certainly at a couple of quick strokes of the key, one can find out a lot. Mostly that is beneficial, with the emphasis on the mostly. It certainly in terms of amiratzis, in terms of providing guidance as a beginning for research, to ensure that a person's study, depending on whether we're talking about Psak Halacha or Limud Torah, but either way, that it is more exhaustive, that it is more representative. All of those things obviously can be very stimulating. They can engender positive independence, and it has. At the same time, again with the same kind of caveats, Talmud Torah requires mentoring, it requires immersion. There's no substitute for day in and day out engagement with DEVAR HASHEM and with Havayis Davai Rava. Person needs to immerse himself, I think, page after page after page, in the Gemara and in the Rambam and in the Shulchan Aruch and in the Parshanim, and in the Jewish philosophers. There's no substitute for that. So the illusion that one could substitute Bikias, let's say, for computer access is something which creates its own dangers and limitations. And I think that is something, I don't want to monopolize the time, that we really need to be aware of and on guard against. And again, you mentioned Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal at the outset, a model for us all, in terms of somebody who, we used to joke, b'talmudo b'yodo, who walked around, with Shas and Rambam and many other things, in his head. Not because, he had a good memory alone and was, therefore able to access his own personal database, but because after day of painstaking analysis and, adding every day to the, to the conceptual analysis of the day before, he became somebody, as all Chachmei Masorah are, who is more than the sum of his parts. I like very much the analogy of a walking Sefer Torah. And a walking Sefer Torah is not something that can ever be substituted for by Bikias access of a computer. So it's very critical that we be aware of that and that we train our Talmidim, what are the constructive benefits of using this and what are the pitfalls or limitations or where this might be counterproductive in terms of developing as Talmidei Chachamim. I think there are also, but I'm not going to mention it now because I want to give time, some very important cultural and educational issues, educational especially in the earlier years, elementary and high school. I think that there's a lot to talk about in terms of whether computer access and databases have been beneficial or more of a crutch and counterproductive. I think also in terms of religious sensibility, the role of the internet culturally is something which needs to be examined very carefully. To be continued.
Thank you for having me on the panel with my Rebbe. Actually, both my Rebbe. I had this chus to learn from Rabbi Taragin in Shana Aleph. He gave the Chabur as a night seder, so this is quite an opportunity for me. Welcome, everyone. Rather than give a perspective on the particulars, I want to try to frame the discussion. It's a gush event, after all. We don't want to talk about too many specifics as much as understanding. I think I want to draw two distinctions. One with the introduction of Rabbi Engel, and the second with a comment mentioned by Rav Rosensweig. And I think they're both important distinctions. You can always have a discussion as to whether or not technology is a good thing or a bad thing, and whether the advent of the internet is overall some positive or negative. But I think that that clouds the discussion sometimes as to whether or not when we're using it for the positive, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? And I assume that that's what we'll discuss here, but those are really two different discussions. Using the internet for a Torah perspective, using it for a Bittul Torah or worse perspective. But we're talking within the Torah perspective. Is it helpful? And what are the positives and the negatives within that perspective? The second thing is that whereas, of course, the advent of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the writing down of Torah Sheba'al Peh represented, as Rav Rosensweig said, a sea change in the way that we approached Torah. It was brought about by an internal need. There was a challenge within the way that we were studying Torah, or the potential to continue to study Torah, and the decision to write down Torah Sheba'al Peh was in response to that need. Here we have something that's really external. We have something that provides a tremendous opportunity. Now, of course, perhaps one could argue there are always better ways to study Torah, but it would be difficult to claim that the Torah world was in crisis, that it was an eis lasos LaHashem. We needed to turn to a digital approach. And that has to make us a lot more cautious. Because this is the digital advances in terms of our learning are an opportunity, but not necessarily a necessity. And that perhaps causes a different, more sober look at those opportunities in relation to what the alternatives are. I think it's also important to recognize that One of the challenges that we always have is that we're always behind the times. The question for us is not so much should we include more of the digital technology, but do we now have to remove it? Right? Of course, as a teacher, as an educator, one might be sitting at a meeting and deciding, and perhaps it's something as a yeshiva that all the yeshivas need to do, yeshiva gedola. To what extent should we begin to go the high school route and integrate more technology into the classroom? But the reality is, much of this shift has already occurred, and now we're at a point where we have to ask ourselves, do we want to take things out of the classroom? One of the things we discussed last year a lot in YU was, are laptops the best way to take notes in a shiur? And what are the positives and the negatives of that? And we know there are many, many studies that say that laptops are very bad for thought and for even retention, that writing notes has a much higher level of retention than simply typing. It's the way the Ribono Shel Olam seem to connect our brains and our hands in writing. So that's one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, what's already there, did we want it? And do we want, and I'll make this the last comment, do we want all of it? One of the questions that we often have when facing something that's coming from the modern world, whether it's a cultural issue or a technological issue, is do we want it or do we not want it? Does it have a place in Torah? Does it not have a place in Torah? And very often the answer is going to have to be, we're going to have to let it in. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, do we want it in exactly the way that it's used or presented in the secular world? Or do we need to kind of take a step back and say, these opportunities are here, but we want some of it, but we don't want all of it. Part of that's the challenge of modern orthodoxy. Once we're saying, yes, it's okay to bring it into our world, how do we bring it into our world in a way that analyzes it, that doesn't accept it at face value, that doesn't say, we need to do it exactly the way it's done, making it a yes or no question, but how do we try to glean the pieces that are valuable and restrict, or unfortunately in our case, remove, because it's already there, it's already in, it's already become part of our culture, the pieces that we've decided through our chachamim and through the leaders of our generation might not be worth taking in.
Thank you both. If I could just pick up on, just as a follow-up question. So I'm a congregational rabbi, and I try to also record shiurim, and in addition to giving shiurim in person, so there's other modalities of communication. I noticed that over time, in my relatively speaking brief career, it seems like people's attention span has gotten shorter and shorter. I don't know if anyone else feels this. This was confirmed for me in 2010. I read a book by Nicholas Carr called The Shallows that was making the rounds in 2010. And he wrote about how in his earlier years he could read research papers, no problem. And as the years went on, even in trying to write a book called The Shallows about how the internet age was impacting, see from the nods, many people have read this book, right, it was impacting the way he thought, his actual way of thinking. He felt he didn't have what we would call, in our parlance, the Sitzfleisch. He just couldn't sit and read. He just couldn't spend the time. And lo and behold, when we were just in a little bit of a conversation earlier, Penner, you mentioned, you know, the analytics of the YU Torah audience indicate that there's a tremendous popularity with shiurim on YU Torah, which is a tremendous resource, as is, I should mention, the VBM and the KMTT, Kim Etzion Teitzei Torah, both of Yeshivat and Etzion, of Taragin, exactly on time for this question. So we're getting into the VBM now. And there's a tremendous popularity. Welcome, Taragin. Tremendous popularity with 5-minute shiurim, 10-minute shiurim, 20-minute shiurim. Many of us, you know, hear from Balbatim, awesome, Rabbi, 10-minute halacha. Why don't you give a 10-minute halacha? Say, do, but 2-minute chamar. Yeah, it's too long, 2-minute chamar. You should give like 2 minutes then. You know, 10 minutes should be like you call us to a shiur, 10 minutes. You know, I've gone in for it myself, to be honest. A group of younger guys, they don't come to shiurim. We're down to 3 minutes of Torah. Literally, I send them a WhatsApp every Friday before Shabbos, 3 minutes on the parsha. And my guarantee to them, which they can check, because it's obviously timed, is that it's under 3 minutes. And knowing those of us who had the good fortune of learning from Rabbi, and both Baha'i Alma and those who have left the world, thinking again of Lichtenstein, abhorred reductionism, abhorred the idea of conflation of complex ideas and intricacies into smaller and smaller packets. And yet, even the VBM, even YU Torah, for all of its greatness, is also indulgent of exactly that. Within the realm of HaShem, by the by, the title, Is the World Too Much With Us, is a question. No one should question whether we should have debates today. Is the internet a good thing or a bad thing? Do we like it or we not? It's here, and it's a reality, and it's a reality of how people learn. The question of extent and how we invite it into the tent is, of course, apt. The Tiferes Yisrael was extolling the virtue of Gutenberg for what he did. But we all know that many things have been printed that don't qualify, certainly not as high literature, not in level of ideas, and have been more than corrosive and threatening and just terrible. There's no other word for them. So I'm curious, do you see over a period of time among your Talmidim, who you interact with in person, a lessening of their, call it Sitzfleisch, ability to focus? Is there a push or a trend that we've somehow indulged that we need to fight against, quote unquote? Is that a tide we really can't counter in terms of the need for increasingly bite-sized bits of information instead of larger packets that have more intricate ideas within them? So I was welcoming with Taragin. With that, as just say hello. He was here the whole time virtually, by the way. Just got here in person. Exactly the same thing. Yeah, Rosensweig spoke and Taragin kind of spoke, but this is a new question. Smaller bikes, do you feel like the Talmud is different from when you started? The same?
I think we struggle on a constant basis as to whether to create a cell phone-free environment that makes matters. The advantages are obviously focus and disconnectedness. In fact, there's a boy in Yeshiva right now who's his third year in Yeshiva. He'll be in Yeshiva next year. And he's finishing his third year. And he decided he wanted to go to the mayor for the summer. So he came over and asked me whether he should attend, and I said, sure, why not? No position through it. But he actually wanted a conversation. He seemed like he wanted to actually parse the issue. I said, well, okay, tell me what you find attractive about going to the mayor. He wasn't so thrilled about the shir per se or chavrusas. He just felt that he wanted to immerse himself in an environment of disconnectedness, of complete immersion, of lack of it. I don't know if there are cell phones in the mirror, but certainly identified with his desire not to be distracted and not to be fractured. Certainly davening is an area, most of this focuses on Talmud Torah, but davening is an area in which cell phone access is really toxic. As disciplined as you may or may not think you are davening from a cell phone, and as much as you may feel that the format is or isn't reverential, but it's almost impossible. And Petropoulos, in this case Larias, but for fractured interest, I think that's something we should really try to ban as much as possible, because it's just such an access point. And it's Yetzirah. And basically, at this point, we still have cell phone access because, in English-based matters, because a lot of Rabbanim employ myself included, was that for continuing Marmukomos and pictures of certain Svarim and certain, creating a fraternity of a shir rather than just a disconnected lecture and preparation. This thing still serves a purpose. But again, I apologize. This is a good chance for me to apologize for coming in late. My flight was delayed and fighting traffic there, Midtown. That's something that takes a little bit longer than 5 minutes. I think I'm extreming the polarities of our modern era. The 5-minute Torah and the 45-minute 1 mile travel through Midtown. But in terms of the brevity of Torah, the flip side is that many people have access to Torah in ways that they haven't before. So by shrinking, and in some cases, to simplifying, but by creating different, I'm not sure that they're mutually exclusive. I think that we have to create tendencies towards sophistication and towards subtlety and length, and I think that the rigorous environment of the base matter should encourage and produce thought and as you said, extended, concentrated development. But I do think that there are people in today's world who have access, and it's always that bar that is constantly moves that way. And many of us remember the yeshiva in the 80s. It was only, we lived through the 80s this last week because of Zachariah Baum, Zechron Lebracha. We're thinking a lot about what yeshiva was like then. And in those days, there really wasn't a Mechina program. And I would say close to 40% of the Hesder portion simply didn't belong in Hesder. And this isn't unique to Yeshiva Etzion. So the Mechina program emerged and it lowered the bar and it created more compatible frameworks for people that were more suitable, but it lowered ambition. So never, and Rav Amital, I think, fueled the concept of the Mechina. So it's always trying to create packaging for Torah to render it relevant and to grant access to people who haven't, I think, I don't want to say this in any way that sounds chas v'shalom disrespectful. I think a lot of the access to women, there's some women today who have access to learning through classic academic frameworks, yeshivos and seminaries and migdalos, but there are many women who don't have that education and don't have the tools, or for that matter, the availability to access Torah in institutional frameworks, to be able to access it online and on fly and on the go. So I think that the nature of Torah is that it's one of the reasons it's compared to water. It's tipin tipin, and then it becomes a nachal. So in Chazal, we're aware of both the value of tipin tipin and the value of a nachal, and the value of something so overwhelmingly powerful. I don't think that we should in any way exclude any avenue of Torah. On the other hand, we have to be careful that those who have access to more rigorous and extensive. I remember just the stories in the summer of Rosensweig would, of course, as you know, Rosensweig would speak Friday evenings, and he would average about an hour 20 minutes for a sikha. And my wife would wait for a kiddush. We'd make kiddush during the summer at 10:30 at night sometimes. So my wife would routinely ask me, what did Marion speak about tonight? He said that Moshe was a good person. He said it took him an hour and a half. I think everyone in this room really was enriched by Mari's propensity for subtlety, sophistication, deep dives into very complex issues. I feel like he took a diamond, put it on an axis, and twirled the diamond 1 degree at a time, and each time he appreciated a different hue and a different coloration. So I think that this yeshiva should stand for that, but not in a way that is either exclusive intellectually or chas v'shalom morally condescending, as if lesser forms of Torah are not worthwhile.
Thank you. So I think there has been a lot written, and some of it quite serious, about the physiological, neurological impact of modern technology, digital technology, internet, etc. I have actually in my hands a book, which I'm not going to read from, so you don't have to worry, but this is one of the early, I guess, prophets against studying on screens, or reading on screens. A fellow named Sven Burkhartz. He wrote very extensively, he was a literary critic, but he wrote a lot about analyzing the difference between reading books and reading from computer screens. And I think he wrote even now, reading it 20 years later, very persuasively about the tactile impact of holding a book, the question of time, as opposed to the psychological impact of knowing that these bits are about to disappear in front of you. And I think that studies subsequently, again, neurological studies, physiological studies, have demonstrated that there is some impact, there's no question. As I said before, requires much more discussion, but I think from a religious and spiritual point of view, the impact of the digital revolution is something which needs to be analyzed in terms of how manageable or overwhelming data is, and the world is. I think the paradox of the world shrinking on the one hand, being more accessible, but the capacity, I guess, to navigate it on your own terms, being something that people feel more impotent about, less capable of, without tools. I think there is a lot to say about many of these issues. At the same time, I have to add that I think that the elementary schools and high schools have zeroed in on this question of shorter time spans, shorter attention spans, and I think that they have conceded much too quickly. I think there's an element of self-fulfilling prophecy. We're getting a lot of complaints in the programs in Eretz Yisrael that the high school students who are coming can't read. Again, that they have all these limitations and deficiencies, and therefore it takes the yeshivot, I guess you could speak this more, the yeshivot much longer to be able to have the impact on them. And again, it also circumscribes that effect and ability. I have to say that in my own experience, this is how you began the question, I think my own experience demonstrates that this all does not have to be so. I found that my own Talmidim, some of whom are in the room, but I'll say it anyway, are totally equal to the task, both the ones who began with me from the beginning. From every decade, I have to say that I haven't really changed my style of giving shiur, not the length of it, not the demands that I make. And I had excellent, Baruch Hashem, I've been zocha to have amazing talmidim from the very first year, and continuing, and I still have amazing talmidim now. To me, that demonstrates that with all of these psychological and physiological and neurological challenges, when people are inspired, when they are sufficiently motivated, they're able to, to rise to the challenge. And as I haven't pulled back kiyuzeh, and I don't think that we should. Again, 5-minute halacha, 10-minute halacha. Again, I don't dismiss it for the people who benefit from it. But the idea that we would be scaling back our aspirations and ambitions for our own talmidim, especially in the years, the formative years, where they develop their, affinity for learning, and when it defines who they are, and also sets a tone for the kind of learning that they will do the rest of their lives, I think is a terrible mistake. I'm very opposed to even alumni, even those who are not in the, both who are in education and not in education, kind of going on maintenance learning, daf yomi or something similar with limited expectations. Again, one of the tremendous gifts that I received from my Rabbeim, the Rav Zatzal, Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal, Rav Vital Zatzal, was to be ambitious for our Talmidim. And my career in Chinuch has convinced me that it can be done, it is done all the time, and that it's a self-fulfilling disaster that we are buying into. Not that there are challenges and issues, because I think that there are, but I believe that there is a way to compensate for them, and a certain way, a way to overcome them. And I think it's critical that we be resolved to do so.
I think, again, as I mentioned before, that some of the damage is done, but I think there's a lot that we can do. I think that for every one of Rosensweig's Talmidim who are ready to put in the time, I think that the bug has caught many students who do want things in a much more compact way. And I think that Rav Rosensweig is saying that we can push them. It's not something that can't be overcome. But I think that the challenge is great, because many Talmidim, especially Talmidim who have perhaps less ability or interest than those who would go to Rabbi Rosensweig, are pushing. And it's a real challenge of sort of finding this balance between understanding that a 2-hour shiur, I mean, I remember certainly being in Rav Rosensweig's shiur at about 2 hours. Certainly remember shiur Kollel from Rav Lichtenstein at, can be 3.5 hours. I won't say that I always stayed awake for 3.5 hours, but that concept today would be rather challenging and difficult to the fellas. So now, how do you sort of continue to push people out of their comfort zone while understanding that the 2-hour shiur is going to be difficult for many of the fellows? I think that that educational institutions need to work together for a commitment to continue to push the students out of their comfort zone and to continue with that. It is very easy, certainly we've seen this amongst yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael, sort of the dumbing down effect of what's expected from the Talmidim with an eye towards recruitment. That's what's going to bring the students, that if you continue to push the students very hard, they're not going to come. If you continue to have them break their teeth and sit in the long shiur and stuff, they're not going to come. There has to be a little bit of locking arms. There has to be a certain amount of communication between the educational institutions saying, we all need to do this. We all need, at each student's level, to be pushing them out of their comfort zone of what they want. There's no question that the attention span has dropped precipitously. It's not only, by the way, attention span, it's also how long, I guess it's an aspect of attention span, how long I have till you catch me. I do the public speaking training with the Smicha fellows. How long does one have to really catch the audience? Most people who are watching things on social media are used to watching things of 60 seconds or less. 60 seconds or less, that's what we're being trained to get a pop from, to get something out of. That's never going to be an amount of time that's going to allow for serious Torah development. At the same time, a different audience, as Rosensweig saying, can benefit tremendously from these 10-minute and 5-minute things. There's no doubt that the ability to study something on the way from X to Y. Remember a conversation that I had heard that they had with Rabbi Yosef, talking about how critical it is to be learning on the bus. How critical it is to take the famous line of the Chassam Sofer that he became a Talmud Chacham in 5 minutes. 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, and I always say to rabbis when I discuss time management that there is an enormous, enormous amount of dead time during the day. You should always have something with you to learn, to pick up, to do. There's always time to do that. So in that sense, the 10 minutes is a wonderful thing. By the way, it also forces the presenter to figure out how to present something in 10 minutes, which is very difficult. We always have in our speech classes a 3-minute presentation. 3 minutes is much harder than a 7-minute presentation. It takes a lot more time to prepare a 3-minute presentation than a 7 or 10-minute presentation. So there is something to be said for that as what it is, as a filler. As a filler, we should fill every moment of ours with Torah, and we should try to find ways to get more out of less. But that can never substitute for truly going into the Amkus HaTorah, truly spending time really understanding and fighting. That's part of what it is, the struggle to learn Torah, is to fight the desire to go off and to do something else, and to stay put and to stay focused on the Sefer that I'm learning. So those are two totally different things. One we need to fight, and one we need to embrace and to enlarge.
I'm going to open it for questions in half a minute. Somebody have another piece.
I'll just add that much of what Rabbi Rosensweig and Rabbi Beren have discussed, the boys actually find it very refreshing to be pushed. They find that change of pace very empowering, and being pushed out of their comfort zone very challenging. And at least the last couple of years in Yeshiva, I think we've been successful in creating an ethos of struggle, of long shiurim, of even shurim that border beyond 2 hours. So I don't think we should be pessimistic as if we're fighting an uphill battle against the resistance and reluctance, and they don't have the attention span. Certain types of students really find it refreshing, and they also find that you're respecting their intelligence if you're pushing them towards greater heights or greater accomplishments. So I think it's an empowering statement as well. It's not just an accommodation.
Somewhat of a personal question for each of you, if you can respond. Do you ever meet a digital Talmud? Have you ever been somewhere and someone came over to you and said, Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi Amori, I have been listening to your shiurim diligently for X number of years. Did that have an impact on you? Did you feel, well, obviously, I put the shiurim out there. It's wonderful. Was that a refreshing encounter? Was this a person who was therefore initiating a relationship ongoing? Or did you feel ambivalent about it, owing to sort of having produced something that ongoing, I'm not talking about a written piece, but an ongoing daily shiur or whatnot, that someone was following you for a period of time, and following is the wrong word, I'm sorry, that's some of the jargon from social media. But actually, your digital Talmud, I would say, is that something that's happened to you, and what was that experience like?
It happens all the time, sometimes in the most unlikely ways. There are people who you just meet randomly who you don't know at all. You meet them in an airport or in other unlikely places, who come over to you and tell you that they heard a particular shiur, but especially people even who follow on a regular basis. They could be following something, a shiur that you gave 15 years ago. Somebody, again, it's happened more than once, comes to me and says, that third point that you made in the fourth, Rambam, and I said that was probably at shiur, was about 15 years ago. But he wants me to remember the order, of the presentation. But it happens all the time. I have actually a few people who listen on a regular basis, who I've gotten to know actually over the years, who live in different different cities and who follow the shir every single day. One of them actually mailed us a Shitas Kamai because he heard online that we couldn't locate one, so that was his contribution to the shir. Some of those people I've come to know, and subsequently, when actually one of them lives in Chicago, this one lives in Chicago actually, as it happens. And I think it's a very wonderful, I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's an excellent example of the opportunities of the digital age. I should say at the same time that I think both for me and for them, having meeting at some point is very important and is transformative. Einecha ros es morecha, is important. People need to know when you're, who you are, what your body language is. They don't see the video, but when you're being humorous and when you're being serious. They need to understand you in context, and this, of course, is the danger. In other words, you have an audience out there who you're not seeing, who have different sensitivities in theory, different backgrounds. The connotation of what you're saying can be very different. It can be very misleading, and sometimes can be very destructive. You have to be very careful, knowing that your shiurim are being recorded. Knowing that there is that additional audience, and at the same time it's very challenging, not to ignore the audience that is in front of you, because that's the first line of the concentric circles. You or your talmidim who are sitting there, and you have to try to balance that, to be responsible and to be aware at the same time, and also to be catering and serving the talmidim in front of you. But just as there cannot be a Talmud Rebbe relationship, only digitally and through video or audio. The same thing is true about the Rebbe-Talmud relationship. And as wonderful as it is, I find that when the people stay in touch and they contact you and you finally get to meet them and know them, that the impact is geometrically improved. So I think this is a growing phenomenon. Mostly it's very constructive, but like personal psak, I think that we also need to be aware, that there are challenges associated with it, dangers even, if we're irresponsible or not aware, but mostly I think it's very beneficial.
I think that very often you have someone come over to you, you look on Torah and you see that the shir that you gave to 4 people was heard by 7,000 people or something like that. It really is, it's something that's very hard for us to fathom, that most of our talmidim might be listening online. Not just listening online, but it's a very different kind of scenario. They aren't a regular talmidim. There's someone who downloaded the shir and picked it up. And that really has to change the way we're presenting. Of course, as Rosensweig saying, the first of the circles, the innermost of the circles are the people you're facing. And especially when you're a Rebbe, I don't teach a regular shir, the amount of importance that's given to the daily shir and to the relationship with Talmidim. I'm usually giving a shir as a guest lecturer somewhere. And I have to remember that most of the people that I'm speaking to are not there and are going to be hearing it in a different context. And that makes me have to be very, very careful about what I say. Very, very careful about what I say. Sometimes you give a shir, someone misunderstands something, they come up right after the shir, and you'll actually get back on the microphone and you'll say, I don't want you to misunderstand this. You can't do that with the tape. The tape's already, the recording, I still call it tape. The recording is already off. But it is impossible to understand how far this goes. I just have to tell you one story. We had a launch for the app, for the YU Torah app. One of the speakers was Rabbi Leibowitz, who gives the 10-minute halacha. So he's facing the audience. Everyone, 500 people are facing the panel. He's facing the audience. And in the back row are 2 fellows who looked actually Hasidic, not neo-Hasidic, actually Hasidic. You could still tell the difference. And he couldn't figure out what they were doing there. They were uncomfortable to be there, but they felt obviously a need to come. So at the end of the panel discussion, they came up to talk to Rabbi Leibowitz. They told them that they're from, I forgot where, I think New Square, and that they listen to his 10-minute halacha religiously in the car. Religiously in the car. And in fact, the kids don't really speak English well, So the father plays it on half speed and explains to them the English so that they can understand what an organized halacha shir would sound like. And they said, we had to come to meet you. You just cannot fathom how far things go in this sense. And again, it's part of the dangers and part of the challenge, but part of the opportunity to reach people, from people who have no connection to Judaism to people who seemingly have other ways and places to learn galore. It's incredible how many people are listening, and it is fascinating to meet them and to hear from them and to get emails from them, etc.
I'll just add, or compliment with what Rabbi Penner just mentioned. First of all, I just returned from Las Vegas, and the reason I spent Shabbos in Las Vegas was not the blackjack tables, obviously. I wouldn't be very good at that, but there were some people who had listened to the shiurim fairly routinely, and they wanted to actually hear the shiurim in person, so I went there for Shabbos. And I think what you just said, Rabbi Penner, resonates very deeply with me, that I think the internet is ideologically colorblind, and some of the cellularization of the Torah world that predated the internet has started to melt away. And it's several instances. In fact, someone I'm very close with, in the spirit of what you described, I met up with him, and now I stay with him when I'm in America, and his whole family, they more or less look to me as a rabbinic influence in their life. And he just happened to come across a shir of mine because he was intrigued. There was a rabbi on YU Torah that didn't have a beard. And he had never heard a shir from someone without a beard. So it was a field trip for him, just to hear that non-bearded rabbis could actually speak. And he got hooked, and they listened to the shir literally every morning at the breakfast table, whatever shir I'd given, and every Shabbos at the table. So I think there's a chance to reach beyond ideological constraints, and to a degree I think I'm not engaged deep. I try to answer all my emails and my messages. I think there's some conservative individuals, reform rabbis, I don't know the level of their orthodoxy, but I know that professionally they're involved in some of those institutions, and I think it's nice for them to be exposed to engaged, sophisticated, but traditional and committed Torah ideas. The only thing I'll add is I think there's a component to the Israel bridging. That there's certain ideas that are very popular in Eretz Yisrael now that haven't necessarily wafted their way fully back to the United States, whether it's Tanakh, whether it's some other ideas. Obviously, there are events in Eretz Yisrael that occur that have deep religious meaning and are deeply connected to who we are as over the HaShem. And I think some of us in Eretz Yisrael see the internet and see the information superhighway as an opportunity to connect those who aren't living these experiences as deeply and don't have that front row seat. I know that during the summer of 2014, I was living, it's not Torah per se, but I think it touched who we were from a Torah perspective, the summer of the kidnapped children and what that meant and how we processed that and what that how it challenged our emunah. And I tried to be as actively engaged in that process. So I think it does expand ideologically and it does bridge geographically. And I think it's a healthier Torah world in which we don't necessarily have to render these rapid judgments based on what people are wearing on their heads or which yeshivas they're associated with. We're able to treat Torah substantively and without any prejudicial preconceptions.
I want to thank each of our three panelists this afternoon for joining us very, very much.